Hi, I'm Supervose. Welcome to the Net Hero podcast. Well, it's happened. We have a Labour government with a massive majority. One of their big things is to push the net zero agenda. Early days, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But where are we with the science? Because without the science, we can't get where we want to go to. And one of the things that's really important is how science works with policy, works with finance. And one of the institutes that does a lot of work on this is the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change. And I'm delighted to say that Bob Ward from that institute joins me today. Hello, Bob.
Hello.
A little bit about the Grantham Research Institute. I think it started in 2008. And is it part of the London School of Economics, or is it a separate entity?
It's a research centre of the London School of Economics and Political Science, founded in 2008.
Right.
It's a multidisciplinary centre, so it brings together academics from across the LSE to work on climate change and environmental policy. We have a sister institute based at Imperial College London that is mostly focused on the science and technology. We're
Yep.
focused on the economics and policy of climate change, both nationally and internationally.
And just before we get into it, for the audience to know, it's independent, right? I mean, you're funded, I hear, from sort of grants and things, but you do all your decisions apolitically. Is that correct?
Yes, we're independent. We're not party politically aligned. We work with any governments that want and any political parties, but we have no political allegiances of our own. Basically, if you take climate change seriously, we will work with you.
Okay. So we can't start without a bit of politics. So the new government, a lot of people said, brilliant, great news, brilliant for net zero, big commitment. A lot of things that, frankly, I am very confused about. Maybe you are. Have no idea what Great British Energy will be. I have no idea how they're going to get to the 2030 target of decarbonising the grid. But putting that aside, what's the initial kind of analysis from your institute of what a Labour government means for our climate change targets?
Well, Labour has come into government with a slightly more positive approach to climate change policy. The last government and the Rishi Sunak had essentially started to drag its feet on climate change. They remain committed to the
Yeah.
targets, particularly the net zero emissions by 2050, but then it started to undermine the policies which were put in place to deliver those. And the narrative around it from the Prime Minister is very negative. So Labour has been more positive about it, but it is not yet laid out how it's going to achieve that greater ambition. You mentioned its most eye-catching commitment is to decarbonize the power grid by 2030, so just 6 years away, which is
Absolutely.
incredibly ambitious. The
Yes.
previous government's target was 2035. That was very ambitious as well.
Correct.
But to do it in 6 years is going to require an incredible amount of effort and work. Now, our biggest worry is that the secret here is going to be investment, both investment by the public sector and the private sector. On the public sector side, the government had initially promised to invest £28 billion a year in climate and environment related spending. That made sense to us because that's the scale of investment required to
Yep.
tackle not just net zero, but all the things we have to do to make ourselves more resilient, and then all the other things we need to do on environmental policy, such as ensuring our cities have clean air and ensuring that our rivers are clean and don't have sewage in them. So it does require a major investment program. In addition, if you look at our economic performance, we have sluggish economic growth and productivity that's not really improving. That can be put down to the fact that we have low levels of public and private investment in this country compared to
Yep.
the G7. Our analysis showed that essentially we were about 3 percentage points lower than the average in the G7. And so we recommended that Labour come into power with a commitment to increasing investment by 3 percentage points of GDP 1 percentage point of that should be in public spending. And unfortunately, Labour then dropped its commitment and has come up with a much less ambitious, which gives us two concerns. One is it will make it much more challenging and much less doubtful that we can reach our net zero target, but it also undermines the Chancellor's mission to deliver on growth. So it's worrying from both those aspects. And at the moment, Labour's promising to follow the Conservative plans, and Conservatives' plans were to reduce public investment over the course of the next Parliament. So that's very worrying. And we would like to see Labour explain how it's going to get where it needs to be if it's not going to be able to make the investment.
The trouble is, I speak to a lot of people in the sector, and I know a lot of people in particularly in distribution and the grid. And it was a huge target, as you said, for 2035. Personal comments made to me is it's impossible to do it to 2030 unless, as you said, and Chris Skidmore said it is possible, we actually have a complete shift in mindset and we have enormous financial backing. And financial backing only happens if a government puts its money in so that the private sector goes, right, this is secure and we'll match fund it or go beyond. Are you worried that once they get their feet under the table, the reality of all the other pressures on the government will mean that thing of actually backing it, and you've got to ask where's the taxes going to come to raise the money, will fall aside? Because the reality is, to get the grid zero by 2030, we're going to have to invest as us, the taxpayer, a hell of a lot of money before anyone in the private sector puts their hand in the pocket.
Well, if we look at this economically, we have a debt. The only way we're going to be able to pay the debt back is by growing the economy. It's the ratio of our debt to the economy that we need to kind of reduce. Now, if we borrow to invest, to create the growth, then that's a good use of funds. And putting artificial restrictions, as we currently have with the so-called fiscal rules, that essentially prevent borrowing to invest, it makes no sense whatsoever. So borrowing to invest makes perfect sense if you're generating growth. What doesn't make sense is having to borrow to, for instance, protect ourselves against high natural gas prices. The last government spent £78 billion on subsidising consumers because natural gas spiked. And that is part of our problem, is that if we are dependent on fossil fuel imports, which we have to be across all of coal, oil and gas, because we will never be self-sufficient, we are vulnerable. We're vulnerable both to these spikes, such as the war, but also to the actions of groups like OPEC, a cartel. So we need an environment in which government is investing, as you say. It needs to introduce a whole range of policies which allow investment. One of the biggest barriers to public and private investment at the moment is the planning laws, which slow everything down. We're never going to get to the 2030 target for the power grid, for instance, with the current planning laws, for instance. And we need a freeing up of that doesn't just ride roughshod over communities, but gets us all together. And this is the crucial point. Labour describes this as a national mission. That's exactly what it needs to be. And a national mission means everybody on board and everybody pushing with the urgency. It can't just be a slogan or a motto. This needs to really engage everybody. We need to everybody engage, which means not just upgrading the power grid, but a speeding up the rate at which we move to electric vehicles and the way that we get rid of gas boilers and replace them with heat pump, for instance. That's what it needs to be.
I know it's very early days, and you'll do some more analysis, I'm sure, as the months go on. But it seems to me that we have, it's always been the fundamental issue here, which is if you look at it from, slightly outside but inside, if you could say, I would say we haven't done what we should have done, right? We should have built more nuclear to give us some low carbon. We should have invested more in onshore wind and offshore wind. And we should definitely be doing much more in terms of storage and also energy efficiency. Now, I've not read anything yet on energy efficiency. We have a massive crisis of our housing stock and all of that. Is your feeling that really governments find that too difficult, right, to go and say, let's go and try and reduce our energy use? And what they're thinking of is, let's go big. It's always sexy. Boris was very keen on, wind. You go big. You go, let's have lots of generation. The grid is cleaner. Then you can have cleaner infrastructure, and that's the way to go to it. Whereas others would say, actually, what you're doing is you're keeping up the demand, and you're not dealing with the fundamental issue of our overuse and waste. Where does the Institute sit on that sort of policy dilemma that governments have had over the last few years?
Well, energy efficiency is a no-brainer because it pays for itself because you reduce the waste of energy. And indeed, part of our problem is that we pay a lot of money for electricity and gas that we get no benefit from because, particularly with heating, it goes out of poorly insulated homes. So we need that to be done. But part of the problem here is the last government had a couple of goes at this.
Yeah, it tried, didn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
And it failed. And it failed because it went about this in the wrong way. It tried to centrally manage it.
Yeah, the Green Homes Grant, all of that stuff. But people didn't take it up, did they?
Well, the people didn't take it up because the so-called consumer journey is terrible, and it's still terrible.
It is, yeah.
So what happens is it's not just the upfront investment, and you need to help households with that cost, but the process of finding a person who you have trust in to get a good price, etc. And the last government was addicted to the idea that the market would fix everything and didn't want to intervene in creating standards or watchdogs. And what we will need, as they have done in Ireland, is to really establish a much more proactive state in helping to create a rapid rollout of these technologies, but doing it in partnership with the private sector, because it's the private sector that's going to install all of this material. The government will have to back them up with a system and with a funding arrangement, so that whatever, there is no argument for a lack of energy efficiency. It just doesn't make any sense. If we make our homes more energy efficient, we will bring down bills. If we make our offices more efficient, we will bring down the cost for business and make them more profitable. So there's absolutely no argument in favor of keeping going with this, but we have such a massive task on our hands that we have to do it in the spirit of a national mission with an urgency and scale, not just a few voluntary schemes that if you feel like it, you can apply, but everybody's got to be signed up, and you ought to know when you are going to be transferring over. And that has to be there has to be an immediate plan to get everybody's home properly insulated, no matter what design it is. Most homes, it will be straightforward. There are some older homes, it will be more complicated. But frankly, if we properly get our hands around this, we should be able to do it relatively quickly. And that's the very first step we should be doing, and making sure we get done alongside the longer term investment generation on the grid.
Yeah. Just lastly, before we move on to other things, Labour has an issue here, which I think is not being fully said, because it's got this duality of wanting to do this, but it also has the unions. A lot of the unions have lots of members in the oil and gas industry. That's number one. Number two, if what you're saying, which kind of makes sense in this national renewal program, you've got to go big on the government, right? It's all about big government. And big government often means that businesses get nervous because they think, actually, like you say, the market doesn't look, there'll be over-regulation, and also will there be the right investment market? So just on those 2 points, where we've had press releases from unions saying, cutting back in certain sectors, heavy industry, which you will need to decarbonise if we're going to hit this. And then what will happen to the jobs in the oil and gas sector if you suddenly go to this? How does Labour navigate those two sort of extremes? One is it's got its unions who are kind of probably fighting for jobs, which is fair, for their members in existing industries around fossil fuel and higher carbon, and it's also quite keen on big government, but it needs to bring business in to believe they won't be taxed out of it to make the investments.
Yeah, well, I mean, from an analytical point of view, it's not big government or little government. They are ideological approaches. It's government with a mission.
Yeah.
And we've seen that if government doesn't have a forward-looking industrial strategy, the de facto industrial strategy they have is being shouted at by incumbents, by industries that are struggling to survive in a changing world who want help. That doesn't work. If the UK wants to be competitive, it needs a forward-looking industrial strategy where the investment is happening to help nurture the businesses of tomorrow and the industries of tomorrow. That's what we need government to be doing, to play its role in investment. But frankly, public investment shouldn't be crowding out private investment. It should be focused on the things which are higher risk, where the private sector is more nervous.
Yes.
And there are lots of scope for the public and the private sector to co-invest with the public sector money essentially representing skin in the game from government to give the private sector the reassurance that the rules aren't going to change. We know that for private sector investors, one of the biggest risks they worry about is policy risk. Sudden changes in policy that means you make an upfront investment and then the government changes the rules and you can't get your return back. So it then makes you nervous. Well, if the government has its own money invested, it becomes less likely to then change the rules because it loses money alongside the private sector. So we want to see more stable policy. We want public investment alongside the private sector, and we need a much greater sense of the direction that the government's going in. It can't just say that the private sector will work this all out. It needs to be providing a very clear direction. That's not the same as necessarily as picking winners of exactly specifying what the grid will need to be, but it does mean saying that we're going to invest. And I have not seen anybody present to me a compelling argument that says that we can afford to eliminate some of these technologies. So it does mean investing in renewables, in nuclear, and in things like carbon capture and storage. We're going to need all of this if we're
absolutely.
really
I totally agree with you, Bob.
about the 2050 net zero target.
One last thing before I just want to talk about the other things that you do, particularly biodiversity and the pollution side of things. Do you think there's been so much rhetoric that it's really polarized this debate? I totally agree with you. I think we need carbon capture, we need nuclear, we need renewable, we need solar, we need storage, we need efficiency. There are people out there who just say, never, get rid of nuclear. It's appalling. There are so many vociferous voices, particularly on the left of the spectrum, who are absolutely against and only believe in electrification. This new Labour government will have to balance that and create this sort of, whether you call it broad church or whatever, a balanced approach, because that's what industry tells me. What do you think, its challenges will be? Because there is now, you've seen there's more Green MPs now than there's ever been elected to Parliament. The Lib Dems have a very different, even further, faster way of trying to cut down our emissions. How does this Labour government balance that? Because there are some people who are just very prejudiced against a balanced approach and only want electrification with renewables.
Well, if you're going to be able to meet the 2050 net zero target, you've got to lay out a very clear strategy for doing that. And you've got to be realistic about the technological progress that's required and about the finance that's going to be required for that. Now, there are arguments against every energy technology.
Of course.
And you've got to be able to sort out those. But anybody who's ideologically opposed to a particular solution, in my view, is making this challenging 2050 target more difficult. And what it's essentially doing is putting their ideology against the welfare of not just people in this country, but people all around the world. Because if we're not serious about 2050 net zero here. We won't convince other countries to take it seriously. And then collectively, we will not get there, and we'll see more damage, more suffering around the world from climate change. But anybody who offers an ideological objection to technology, in my view, is an obstacle to progress on this. And we can't afford to do that. Government has to be laser focused on analytical and clear-headed thinking about how to get where we need to be.
I want to leave Bob there just for a second, because the point he was making there about laser sharp focus on what governments to do was a question I asked two of our Big Zero speakers just after the show ended a week or so ago. Vicky Pryce is a leading economist, and Nick Molden runs emissions analytics. And I asked them what they thought would be the things that government needs to do, and where particularly the two big things that really kind of typify net zero: the visualization of net zero through transport, EVs, and also the finance, what the challenges are ahead. Have a listen to what they said. The reason I wanted both of you, because finance is everything, obviously, and EVs and transportation are the two, sort of, I suppose, one of the biggest things that people have noticed. If you say to people, what does net zero mean? They go, oh, electric cars. So let's just start on that. A lot of myths, which, and today you sort of debunked a few of them, but you said, very interestingly, we were just talking off air, that you said, you know, the thing that will really matter is the mass of a car. Why does that matter more than anything else about the emissions that car will produce?
It is because if you go through it systematically and looking at the actual evidence of what the environmental impact correlates with, actually the mass of the vehicle is associated with so many things. Not everything, but the key ones like carbon dioxide, either in the manufacturing or in the use, things like tyre emissions, which are becoming a much more important environmental impact of vehicle. Mass seems to be the key, and it gets you a long way there. And the beauty about mass is it's a really simple thing to measure and a very hard thing for anyone to cheat. And so I think that, that and the penny is beginning to drop because it has an intuitive dimension to it. When you talk to people who might be EV evangelists, actually they don't like the fact that vehicles are really heavy as well. And so that's beginning to dawn on people, and I think and I hope we will move from a position around battery electric vehicles, which is very dogmatic, very evangelical, now to one which is more realism and pragmatism and a desire to actually get the net zero job done.
A lot of the businesses here today, they're looking at exactly that, electrification of fleets, and something that is the only answer. You talked about new technologies, you talked about, do we go much more for bang for buck in emissions, having more hybrids? You talked about people using synthetic fuels, e-fuels. Has there been a dogma, do you think, that stopped us looking at the range of things, and it's all been a big push, not just policy-wise, but manufacturing-wise as well, about EVs?
Oh, undoubtedly. And I would go so far as to say a government-funded dogma. I think the plan was that everyone in the know, knowing how expensive it will be to decarbonise, the idea was to talk up battery electric vehicles so much to make it a fait accompli in people's minds. So you just wouldn't buy another internal combustion engine for fear of the accelerated depreciation. What's happened in reality is consumers have said, well, electric vehicles, they have some advantages, but they don't always work for me. So people are actually now going backwards. They're actually saying that the utility is not quite there. They're too expensive. So consumers are actually saying to go and actually, no, your policy doesn't make sense for us. And so we're going to go more down the hybrid route.
Financially, you talked about kind of the pressures that are out there and the investment globally in net zero. Do you see it as a picture where the finance community is still thinking, I'm going to hold back because I'm not getting those strong long-term policy signals?
I think having some stability in policy is very important. And if you do get those long policy signals, that you may do the investments in a sustained way that are needed. But of course, we mustn't invest in the wrong areas, as we've just been saying. So value for money, but also, are there loads and loads of unintended consequences in whatever you do? So you go down one route and you could destroy some other bit of the habitat, for example, or perhaps you focus too much on trying to attract investment in your country, in your region, which is what's going on in Europe and the US, and you forget that most of the increase in demand for energy is going to be in the developing world, and have we transferred enough money there to ensure that they can deal with whatever's going to hit them, because that's where populations are growing, not necessarily in the West. So you've got to be careful. Yes, you can have a policy and say that's what we're going to do, like we've been hearing with EVs, but is this the right one? So it needs to be constantly looked at again. And I'm afraid companies themselves will have to be quite nimble in that. And as the world moves towards, really understanding that we have to decarbonize, whether they can come themselves with some of their own solutions, because we're trying quite a lot of technology right now. And I think what we need to do is invest a lot more in that technology and then see what the various options are and make absolutely certain that if we go down one particular route, we are aware of some of the costs involved elsewhere and we try and mitigate those too.
You're a leading economist. One thing that never has seemed to have come to fruition, I thought it might do after COP in Glasgow, is a proper carbon market, a priced, standard for it that's globally that we can then use to trade and say, right, if you do this. Do you think that is anywhere near the pipeline in the next 5 years, or is it still a kind of dream?
We've got some carbon markets that are going. I mean, we've got one in the EU. We have one here. We did, of course, have EU ETS, which is the sort of exchange mechanism that was there in terms of emissions. Now we do have a proper carbon price, but it may not necessarily reflect the right value that we should be putting on emissions. And also, of course, it's very confused by the whole offsetting market where carbon is valued a lot less right now. And there is also the issue of the developing world. What we've got in Europe, for example, is this intention to properly put tariffs on things that are coming out from elsewhere, which have been produced under conditions where carbon emissions have not necessarily been restrained in any way. So because we've all offshored so much in terms of production. So carbon adjustment, tariff adjustment mechanism is what is being put forward. In fact, it's already started operating. We may do the same here in the UK. That, of course, disadvantages quite a lot of developing countries, which still need to grow somehow.
Yeah.
But what you've also got is institutions like the International Monetary Fund are suggesting that if there is a proper carbon market, you still need to have a lower tariff or a lower carbon price for the developing world. Depends, of course, on the stages of development. So the idea, Mrs. you ask, can we have a single world carbon price is actually quite a difficult one.
Vicky Pryce and Nick Molden. Right, let's get back to my podcast with Bob Ward. And in this part of it, I started to talk about the wider issues, not just carbon, when it comes to our environment. The Institute does a lot of work. We've talked about policy, and I'm going to park that for now. But you also look at two areas which I think is very interesting, which is kind of the biodiversity and also, I'll just call it pollution, right? The destruction of our biosphere, the amount of plastics in there. These areas I've always found very important to look at, but they've never really got into the frame. If we started to clean up our rivers and got rid of the microplastics and cleaned up the sewage and all that would make a massive difference. But it always seems to be, the argument is it's climate change and it means, CO2 and it means, going electric. Why is the Institute looking at those two other areas, particularly the loss of habitat and then the sort of bioremediation actions that we need to take regarding what used to be called in my day pollution?
Yeah, there's been a misunderstanding up to now, which is based on poor economics, that somehow if you spend money on protecting the environment, you're somehow sacrificing the economy. And that's nonsense, because we can see. So if you take the issue of air pollution costs countries huge amounts in terms of growth. If people cannot go to work because the air outside's too dirty, or they're afraid, they don't want to move into a city because they're worried about their children, that's going to cripple your economy. And indeed, that's exactly what the economic analysis shows. The countries that have the worst air pollution, like India at the moment, it's knocking several percentage points off their annual growth. Now, that doesn't make economic sense, let alone any other sense. What we also know is that if you only look at these issues narrowly in silos, you can take decisions that might be good, for instance, for climate change, but which are bad for air pollution. And that's exactly what happened in the UK a few years ago, where on climate grounds, there was an attempt to favour diesel
Of course.
engines.
Yeah.
What we did is therefore diesel creates more air pollution because it releases more particulate, so we made the air pollution problem. Most of the solutions we need to do for climate change can be done in a way that is both better for nature and for air pollution. Cutting the consumption of fossil fuels is good for both climate change and for air pollution. Stopping deforestation is good for biodiversity and for the climate. So a rounded view of how to do this, because it is much, much more expensive dealing with the consequences of waste and pollution and damage than it is preventing it. And it's just good economic sense, let alone good environmental sense. And that's why we are so focused on those issues as well.
I mean, we've done quite a lot of work and talked to people around the world, and I know you do that. And you touched on it earlier. And before we go, there is a real shock that's gone around the world over the last 5 years. COVID, then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, now the Middle East crisis, tensions between China and Taiwan. There's so many global issues that are, affecting the way people and governments have a priority to their own citizens, obviously. Where do you think we are internationally on this? Because you can criticize the governments of China, Brazil, India, the Philippines, whatever, because if they're trying to do other things for economic growth. But they are also investing as well, and they've got a lot to lose, as you say. They're the parts of the Caribbean, you've just seen what's happened there. How do we feel we really are in terms of this being an issue that the global community is involved in? Because there's a lot of lecturing this side. We've had all the COPs, we've seen it. I'm sure you've been in the sector a long time, I know that. It doesn't seem like we've actually got a global consensus anywhere near it. And I can understand why in some ways, because there's been so many shocks. Where does the Institute sit when you talk to your peers in other nations around where we are globally on this whole topic?
Well, I think, we should remember that we had in 2015 two very important global international agreements that should be guiding government action. One was the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, set targets for 2030. We're not on target for those, but they laid out 17 goals that really would be about enhancing development all across the world in a way that didn't force people to falsely choose between having a healthy environment in which to live and their prosperity.
Yes.
And we had the Paris Agreement. So we have demonstrated that we can do this. But the delivery has been poor.
Yeah.
Mostly the responsibility is the rich countries. They have failed to deliver on their promises. The UK in particular has been a terrible international partner recently. It reduced its official development assistance goal. That was a terrible, terrible mistake because, and it's self-defeating because helping other countries deal with their problems reduces the chance that they undergo shocks that will cause their populations to want to flee.
Yeah, this is absolutely, you've hit that thing about the migration challenge facing the world.
So it's a morally right, but even if you weren't convinced of the moral, it's in your enlightened self-interest to want to help countries deal with it. But the developed countries, rich countries have reneged on many promises. They didn't meet their promise, for instance, to be mobilizing $100 billion a year to help finance climate action in developing countries by 2020. It's recently got there in the last couple of years. But the poor countries and the developing countries have time and again had their trust in rich countries thwarted. And that's why we need, in the G7, a series of leaders who take international responsibility seriously and deliver on their goals, because on these environmental questions, we are all in this together. There is no way you can insulate yourself from the damage, the causes of that. And so if you act in a narrow conception of self-interest, you ultimately undermine your self-interest by not helping others tackle these problems. You are not going to persuade China to be more ambitious on climate policy if you say, oh, well, we're less than 1% of emissions, so we can afford to drag our feet. that's ridiculous. Nobody will take you seriously. When I talk to Chinese policymakers,
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
Chinese scholars, they say, what are you doing that we can learn from? And they want to look at the examples. We have got successes. We've got coal off the grid much quicker.
We've done a lot of great things.
We've done overseas. Had offshore wind. So we have got successes. They're the things we should focus on, and we should now focus on developing other ways of showing leadership in this, because we need to show leadership and we need to respect our responsibilities to other countries, particularly in the developing countries, because they're the ones who are most exposed and vulnerable to the impacts. And if they are feeling and vulnerable and exposed, they won't a lot of them will suffer, but a lot of them will mobilize. And if you worry about migration at the moment, think about a world that's being ravaged by the worst effects of climate change. What kind of migration we'll have? We'll have refugees on a scale we've never seen before.
If people are interested in what you're doing, I know it's very scientific, but is there stuff at the Grantham Institute that people can understand, lay people, business people?
Yes, we have on our website, we have a whole series of explainers that are written for a lay audience. They link to to publications. We have a range of technical publications, but we have material there that's written for policymakers, which the average person should be able to understand. And if you have a question that you want answered that you don't find on the website, then they should write to me. You can find my email address on the website.
Brilliant. I think the whole thing is it's what we try and do, making facts and science accessible helps people make the right business decisions, and that's really ultimately what gives us to the right investments. Bob, I really appreciate our chat. I'd hope to bring you back on the podcast again, maybe in 6 months or something like that. We'll look at where policy is going. If you'd like to do that, that'd be brilliant.
Indeed. I'd very much like to. And thank you for giving me the chance this morning.
No problems. That's Bob Ward from the Grantham Institute. Really brilliant stuff there. Have a look. What's your view on where the new Labour government is going? Whether you feel as a business there's the right triggers for you to do the investment, get in touch. And if you'd like to be on the podcast, remember it's Net Hero at futurenetzero.com. I'll see you next time.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.